Well, Dan, thank you very much for having me. I'm privileged to be with everyone today, and felt quite strange when you called me captain again. It hasn't happened in the last 12 months, but yes, exciting career I've had in aviation, over 40 years flying aircraft in the military and in commercial aviation. And yeah, looking forward to the next 45 minutes together. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Wayne, we're very grateful to have you on the show today. Wayne, late last year, Boeing and CAE released their short to medium-term pilot forecast projections, which made for very exciting and encouraging reading. The pilot demand during the present time, with retrenchment and slowdowns, was unexpected. For those watching who may be new to the aviation industry, Boeing will be a well-known name, but others may be hearing about CAE for the first time. So just for the benefit of those who may be new to CAE, who are CAE?
Right, well, CAE are by far the largest supplier of training products to global aviation. They hold probably around about 80% of the market share with respect to training, from ab initio all the way through to airline, regional and business aviation operations. They are a major force in global aviation operations and training requirements. They're also the largest manufacturer of simulators that are used in commercial aviation and military aviation applications. So very much a large force to be reckoned with, and someone that you should sit up and listen to when they talk. They know what they're talking about.
Okay, so CAE has a massive stake, if you will, in the training industry. Boeing, you know, manufactures aircraft, well-known product. They both recently released forecasts. What exactly are those numbers telling us with regards to the recovery in aviation?
All right, Dan, what I'd like to do is I'd like to maybe just, out of the two forecasts, the forecasts were released in September and November of last year, the CAE forecast in September and the Boeing one in November. I've put a small little presentation together, and I'd ask Tali just to bring up the first slide, please. This presentation, or these slides I'm going to work through for the next, say, 10 minutes, will highlight the main aspects from the two forecasts. And I'd like to start off with the IATA economics chart. You'll see that was produced on the 30th of July 2020, right in the middle of the COVID pandemic. And for those of you that don't understand who IATA are, they are the International Air Transport Association. They represent over 280 airlines globally, all right, and hold around about 82% of the interests of commercial operations globally. So they're an association that look after the economics and operating doctrines of, as I said, 82% of the operators that fly around the world. If we look at the graph, steady increase in what they call RPKs. That's revenue passenger kilometers. Big fancy term, but IATA and any airline with respect to making money, in trillions of revenue passenger kilometers flown, that's what they base everything on. And as you can see, the graph from early 2010 through to 2025, the predicted graph before COVID was there was a steady increase in revenue passenger kilometers flown. With the onset of COVID in 2019, you can see the very rapid decrease in RPKs, and then in the yellow band, the IATA forecast of return almost to normality of pre-COVID-19, the baseline that will occur by 2024, 2025. So not exactly where it was going to be, but certainly getting very close to what the predicted RPKs would have been come 2025. On the next slide, you'll see there is a prediction by CAE. And CAE, as I've previously explained, made this statement in September of last year in their forecast. And I might add both the Boeing forecasts, which we'll talk about now, and the CAE forecasts will be available via hyperlinks that will be available on the portal from after the presentation. So both these presentations in toto will be available afterwards. But the CAA forecast indicated that over 260,000 new pilots will be needed over the next decade, in the next 10 years. That's 260,000 pilots over the next 10 years. Now, anyone with a calculator can quickly calculate. That's over 71 pilots per day. That's type-rated pilots per day are going to be needed by the aviation industry in the next 10 years. 71 pilots per day. The next slide I'd like to talk about is the Boeing forecast. Now, we've spoken a bit about CA. We're going to come back to their forecast in a short while. But the Boeing pilot and technician outlook forecast, their prediction there, or their forecast, runs over a slightly longer period. It's between 2020 and 2039, so the 19-year period. And on the next slide, you'll see clearly where Boeing believe the personal demand is going to be. Just for pilots over the next 19 years, Boeing's indicating their predictions, which were done in November last year. Right, pilots, 763,000 pilots. 763,000 pilots forecast by Boeing are needed over the next 19 years. That equates to around about 110 pilots per day. So CAE are saying 71 pilots per day over the next 10 years. Boeing are extrapolating that further forward and saying over 100 pilots, 110 pilots per day over the next 19-year period. So a very rosy outlook. The next slide takes us back to the CAE forecast. As I said, produced in September of last year. And on slide 6, you'll see CAE are supporting their data with a requirement or new influx of 7,800 commercial aircraft between 2020 and 2029. That's a new two fleet of 7,800 new aircraft into commercial aviation. Again, a number that needs to be considered. Now let's look at, on slide 7, who are flying these aircraft at the moment. This is now pre-COVID, or let's say in 2020. And you'll see from the pie graph, the average airline pilot age sits at around about 46. Average airline pilot age is 46, and in business aviation, that gets to about 49. And from the split in the graphs here, you'll see between 35 and 49, there's a very large segment of pilots in that age group, and then over 50, an equally large group of pilots. Why am I highlighting this? Because pilots retire at the age of 65, 63 to 65. So if we look forward over the next 10 years, there is going to be a massive shortage of pilots, left-hand seat, highly qualified commanders in the next 10 to 12 years, just based on the average age of pilots in aviation right now. So not only is there going to be a large influx over 7,800 to 8,000 new aircraft coming into service, but pilots are going to be coming up their retirement age a lot sooner than aviation had planned for, purely because of the age split of pilots in aviation at the moment. Right, on the next slide, you'll see, coming back to the 7,800 pilots, what I want to touch on this is that in 2029, the predictions are that there'll be over 36,000 active passenger airliners in service. All right, 36,000 active passenger airliners. Now, why do I say that? Because we talk about crew ratios when it comes to aviation. Now, crew ratios is the number of pilots needed to fly an airplane. Okay, so with 36,000 active passenger airliners in service in the next 10 years, okay, on a regional operation, average 10 pilots per aircraft are needed to operate on a normal regional route structure. On a narrow-bodied route structure, 11 pilots per aircraft, and these are proven IATA numbers. And on a wide-bodied, or let's say a long-range operation, 17 pilots per aircraft. So that equates to a new pilot growth of over 93,000 pilots needed based on those crew ratios by the year 2029. That's a very large number, 93,000 new pilots needed just for the growth. That takes us to the second last slide. which then covers the different segments. So the first segment I looked at in light blue and black is then obviously your airline and your business jet segment. At the moment, 33,000 pilots actively flying airliners and about 54,000 flying biz jets around the world. Pilot replacements based on the aircraft or retrenchments, retirements, around about 126,000 airline pilots and 41,000 biz jet pilots. With respect to additional pilots for growth, the 93,000 we've touched on already, looking at those crew ratios, taking us in airline operations to around about 426,000 pilots, from 333,000 to 426,000 pilots in the next 10 years. That's just in the airline industry. And you can see we're going from 54,000 pilots in bizjet aviation to around about 58,000 in the next 10 years. So the reason for this graph is that if you were positioning yourself for a career in aviation, where would you be positioning yourself? In the airline business or flying airliners, or would you be positioning yourself to be flying other segments of aviation? And it's quite clear from this graph is that the airline industry is where you should be positioning yourself. And that figure at the bottom there of over 220,000 or 219,000 airline pilots needed is what supports that statement. Right, where are these pilots going to be needed? The last graph takes us and shows us that. And as you can see, Asia Pacific is by far the largest area or growth area with respect to pilot demand in the next 10 years. 91,000 pilots are needed just to satisfy the requirements in the Asia Pacific area. Compare that to in Africa of 4,000 pilots. Where would you be positioning yourself if you were looking for a career in aviation based on the data from established and known data sources? Where would you position yourself? In an African type operation or Asian Pacific type operation? That's the question that we're going to be just talking about in a short while. Great, thanks Charlie, and back to you, Dan.
Wayne, thanks. Yeah, big numbers being thrown around there. Hey, 260,000 pilots required, 71 pilots a day, according to CAE. Boeing forecasting 763,000 over the next 2 decades, 264,000 over the next year. Massive, massive numbers, and certainly a much more encouraging picture than what we have been experiencing lately. Now, Wayne, with these big numbers being thrown around, 7,800 aircraft required in the next decade, how can someone new to the industry capitalize on this forecast requirement?
Well, Dan, it's the age-old story, chicken and egg. Really what I want to leave with you, you need to make yourself attractive for employment. That's what this is about. There's a wave coming. There's a massive storm coming, let alone a wave coming, all right? And how can you best position yourself to be part of the growth that's forecast, anticipated, and will be coming in the next 10 and longer period? So make yourself attractive for employment. Make sure your CV is something that an employer wants to read. Make sure that your CV is attractive to an employer. Get qualified. Make sure that you have the correct qualifications and the correct experience levels that operators are looking for pilots that they're going to be employing, these large number of pilots that they're going to be employing in the short and medium term. Now, we'll talk on, I know you're going to talk about it a little bit later, but we're going to talk about how we're going to qualify ourselves, but we'll come back to that in a short while. I think probably more importantly as well is understand and determine your goals of where you want to position yourself to operate within this aviation, this global aviation system. All right. Is it going to be Asia Pacific? Is it going to be America? Is it going to be Europe? All right. Is it going to be Africa? Where are you going to position yourself over the next 10 years? That's probably vitally important as well. And then at the same time, understand the market vacuums that are going to be experienced as the pilot uptake or intake moves forward over the next 10 years. Now, let me explain that a little bit more. Traditionally, pilots join regional operators or low-cost operators in the right-hand seat as a first officer, okay? With the pilot shortage and the age differential that we've looked at, of pilots coming up retirement age, there's going to be a massive movement in the next 10 years between pilots from the right-hand seat, first officers, into the left-hand seat to become commanders, okay? And typically, in your low-cost operators, which are being fed by the regional operators, the regional operator pilots are going to be absorbed by the low-cost operators. The low-cost operator pilots are going to be absorbed by your legacy-type carriers, okay, your Qantases, your British Airways, Lufthansas, Deltas, United, etc. So there's going to be a rapid movement of pilots. And I think importantly, you need to position yourself so that as this movement of pilots or this vacuum starts occurring in the regional and the low-cost operator space, you are correctly positioned to be taking up positions in those areas.
Okay, Wayne, well, let's touch on that specifically. A lot of pressure on the market right now, a lot of very qualified personnel seeking opportunity. We know, based on what CAE and Boeing are forecasting, that there is opportunity coming. Now, you said you need to make yourself attractive to an employer. The CV needs to be something that's readable. You also mentioned getting qualified. Now, there are a lot of people that may not have entered into the industry yet that are considering entering into the industry as a career and may have doubts right now. If I want to position myself to catch this wave, wouldn't it be the right time to qualify? Or begin training to qualify, should I rather say?
Yeah, I think it's an important question for any sponsor and anyone that's going to be spending a very, very large sum of money on aviation training. It's not a cheap industry to get into. We're all aware of the kind of numbers that are going to be spent, over R1 million, absolutely, just to get yourself into a point where you are now qualified. All right, so it's a very important question. But my answer would be very, very simply, when should I start training? And the simple answer is now. Why do I say now? If you look at a timeline between entering ab initio training and gaining your commercial pilot's license, if you're really diligent and you weather plays along and things work out the way they should, you have the correct sponsor and sponsoring to make it happen, we're looking at about an 18 to 24 month timeline from the time that you commence until the time that you qualify as a commercial pilot. It can be done in a shorter timeline, but generally speaking, our experience is 18 to 24 months is the general timeline that it takes. If you go to give yourself another 12 months on top of that to get the additional qualifications that the operators are looking for, bridging type training, making yourself attractive, possibly type ratings, etc. All right, another 12-month timeline is needed to qualify yourself and make application to the operators. Okay, so that you're looking at a 36-month timeline from the time that you start with this process of aviation training to where you are now possibly eligible for employment. That's 3 years into this whole process. So when should we be starting? Right now. If you want to ride the wave, time is now to start.
Okay, that will be encouraging news for a lot of people watching, I'm sure. But also sort of people that have qualified or sitting in the training pipeline that will be qualifying within the next year. We've mentioned the growth areas. Asia Pacific region is a nice region to be targeting. The second nice region is the United States, followed by Europe, requiring quite large amounts of pilots over the next decade or so. The question is, once I've qualified, what pathways are available for me as a qualified pilot to start tapping into those markets? How do I go about positioning myself for entry into, say, the Asia Pacific region?
Okay, Dan, I think it's not the pathway that you're going to be tapping into. I think you need to be an absolute realist. All right. First of all, like I said earlier, you need to have a plan. You need to have a goal. You need to understand where you want to position yourself based on the data that is available. All right. The data is out there, and based on the data that is there, where are you going to be probably get the best chance of employment, gainful employment long term? In what geographical area? That's really what you need to be looking at from a pathway point of view. Now, that pathway, unfortunately, is hampered by certain barriers. The first barrier to entry is that wherever I operate internationally, I need to satisfy the regulatory or that CAA's requirement for licensing. So if I'm going to operate in America, I need a FAA license. If I'm going to operate in the, let's say, the European operational area, I need an EASA license, all right, or UK license, depending where you're going to go, of course. Asia Pacific, slightly different. Each of the various regions, the regional CAAs possibly could accept an ICAO license on a validation, or you might have to, for example, in China, go and write the Chinese license and get yourself a Chinese license. So the first barrier to entry in any of these regions would be a license. You need to either convert your ICAO license or hold the license to operate in that area. That's the first thing. The second one would be the right to live and work in that geographical area. All right? Meaning, do I hold a passport? Do I have the right to actually work or be employed in that geographical area? That needs to be established as well. Okay. With the uptake of pilots that are going to be needed internationally, it is a known fact that many airlines can influence your ability to get residency and the right to work in those geographical areas. So I don't see that as a major hindrance, purely based on the numbers of pilots that are needed. Airlines are going to have to become involved and get approvals for you to operate and work in those environments. Okay, but the licensing, unfortunately, is going to be up to you. Yeah. The next barrier to entry is qualifications. What qualifications are the various operators in those geographical areas that you've now determined? All right, what qualifications do they require for you to be eligible for employment? And that's going to be up to you now to go and determine where do I want to work and what are the requirements based on all the various operators that I possibly could be employed by. What are their requirements to operate with?
Wayne, just sticking on that, in terms of qualifications, making yourself attractive to a prospective employer. A lot of debates often had around, should I go Airbus, should I go Boeing, should I even look at obtaining a type rating? Now, the question I had then is, how do I decide on what platform to invest in? Because we know type ratings aren't cheap, and is it worthwhile investing in a type rating to make yourself more attractive to an operator?
All right, so that question is twofold. I'll come back to the manufacturer in a short while, but let's talk about type ratings first. All right, let's talk about qualifications post-CPL, making yourself eligible for an operator. Okay. As I said, the pathway into commercial aviation for the majority of pilots is not directly into a legacy carrier. Legacy carriers, the Qantases, the Lufthansas, the British Airways, they all have cadet pilot schemes. All right. So for entry into those type of airlines, it would be through a cadet pilot program, which is a sponsored program. Okay. Anyone else moving into aviation starts at the bottom of the ladder, and that would be through regional operations or otherwise low-cost operations, low-cost carriers. Okay. Now, low-cost carriers and regional operators are incredibly price sensitive with respect to employment. They're always going to look for the most cost-effective pilot to employ. So if we have two pilots, pilot A that has a type rating or pilot B that does not have a type rating, they both are likable people. They both satisfy the operator's requirements with respect to employment. The operator or the low cost or the regional operator will always take the line of least resistance, and the person that is going to cost the least to actually train and get up to speed is the one that they're going to take. All right. So from a type rating point of view, if you're going to be using a type rating for an operator, it would always be best to approach an operator with the type rating from a reputable company, of course. Okay. Now, with the type rating, you'd obviously be you'd be better eligible for employment than without a type rating in a low-cost or regional operation. First of all, that's the type rating. Now, let's talk about aircraft type. There are three aircraft types that you are going to be employed on initially in commercial operations. They are an Embraer, a 135 or a 145 regional jet, or otherwise the 170 or 190. Okay, slightly longer range, more sophisticated aircraft. So you're going to enter via an Embraer type operation. Embraers, as you are probably aware, if you do your homework, a very strong market share in regional operations in the United States and Canada, starting to make a presence in Europe at the moment, and an even stronger presence in the Pacific Rim and Indian operations as well. They are starting to get a market share in those areas. That's what where the Embraer is at the moment. And obviously their home base is South America, large amount of operators operating Embraers in South America and Africa as well. So that's the Embraer. Probably takes up about 20% of the total aircraft flown in the regional and narrow-bodied operations. Then we get Boeing and Airbus. All right, about a 50-50 split. They make up the rest of the 80% of operators. Okay, it's Boeing and Airbus. And what I want to talk about here is that as a pilot, we cannot change aircraft types every second year. We need to become a specialist in the aircraft type that we operate. Okay, so we either become an Embraer specialist, we become a Boeing specialist, or we become an Airbus specialist. And that's what an operator is looking for. They're looking for time on type. And it's not as a first officer. What you're trying to do is position yourself, and it takes on average around about 3 years operating, about 3,000 hours, 3,000 to 4,000 hours, right, as a first officer before you'll be upgraded as a captain on type. So we're looking for longevity on that aircraft type, be it a Boeing or an Airbus or an Embraer, okay? And that's going to be the best pathway moving forward. So looking at the numbers from CAE with respect to 426,000 pilots needed in airline operations in the next 10 years, all right, where would you be positioning yourself? If it was my money, I'd be positioning myself on a Boeing or on an Airbus. Those would be the two types that I'd be looking at.
Perfect. Now, before we touch on the next question, guys, we'll be taking questions shortly. So if you have any questions to ask Captain Westoby, please post them into the chat box, and we'll address them at the end during the question and answer segment of the discussion. Finally, what advice would you have for pilots considering entering into the industry at the moment? You've had an extensive career over 40 years, military and civil and training. Having gone through the system and knowing what it takes, what advice would you have for those looking at entering into the industry the first time, or people that have recently qualified?
Dan, again, a multifaceted question, but quite simply answered this way. Have a goal. Be structured in your approach. That's vital. If you don't know where you're going, you're never ever going to be able to get there. All right. So understand where you're going, what you want to try and achieve, and work every single day at moving down that pathway to achieve what you want to achieve. All right. You don't just fall into aviation and then hope for the best. You have to stand out head and shoulders above the other pilots or other crew members that are applying for exactly the same position, and have a plan of how you're going to get there. All right. Aviation is a long pathway. It doesn't happen in the 2-3 years that you commence at the bottom. It's a 10 to 15 year pathway before you really start establishing yourself in aviation. And you need to understand where you want to be, or try and understand where you want to be over that time period. So give yourself a 5 or a 10 year goal, all right, and work towards that goal. That is vitally, vitally important to be successful. Be honest to yourself as well. Don't shoot at the stars when possibly the moon is the best that you're going to achieve. All right. Be realistic in what you can achieve. All right. With obviously keeping costs in mind as well. And if you are going to spend money, please, if you're going to spend any money in aviation, spend it in the correct direction. Don't just spend it because other people have spent it and doing the same thing. Understand what you're trying to achieve and spend your money wisely. That is vitally important.
Perfect. Well, thanks very, very much for that. A lot of good gems and a lot of encouraging news for the industry and those hoping to get into the industry. Before we take some questions, has there been any sign within operators regarding any kind of recovery at this stage? Has there been an uptick in pilot numbers, or are operators drawing pilots back into service?
Well, I think I always use flight radar as a true barometer of what's actually happening right now, live around the world. If you haven't downloaded the app, Flight Radar, it's an incredibly interesting tool to use. And if you just open Flight Radar right now, have a look what's happening in the United States, have a look what's looking in Europe, have a look in through the Balkan states, have a look what's happening in the Asia Pacific area. more and more aircraft are airborne every single day. And I think a very exciting, I read it last night on the wires, very exciting, Delta in this week have now announced that they are returning to a full pilot roster. They're recalling all their pilots back into Delta, and they will be flying a full roster, Delta Airways, as from October this year. So yes, COVID-19 has been dramatic to everybody. The vaccinations haven't yet taken effect around the world, but when guys like Delta are recalling all pilots and putting all their aircraft back into service,
that's fantastic news.
And what Boeing have been saying is actually happening.
That's fantastic news, Wayne. It's very, very positive to hear that it has been a tough year, the past year, and but it's nice to see that upswing and trend towards recovery. The data's all there, supports it. We just need to, as you say, prepare ourselves to catch that wave. But thanks for all your insights. We're just going to take a few questions. We do have a few in the chat box here. Adelaide says, good morning. Thank you for the talk. How do you choose between Boeing, Airbus, and Embraer? And what do you look out for and consider? It's a good question.
Right, I've got, I think it's in my 22,000 hours as a pilot, I've got an equal split between Boeing and Airbus hour-wise. So I sit on the fence, okay? I have never operated an Embraer, so I don't speak with conviction about Embraers. But if I go back to between Boeing and Airbus, I think a very important element with respect to Airbus that you need to consider, all right, as a pilot and training, is that at Airbus, by qualifying yourself, say, on an Airbus 320 series of aircraft, all right, to move from a 320 to a 330 or a 350, all right, Airbus 350 is only a 4-day conversion, a 4-day conversion. So it's called a CCQ program, all right. So moving from a smaller Airbus to a larger Airbus is a very short timeline in conversion time. Makes it quite easy then to move around from an operator perspective. So if I qualify myself on an Airbus 320, for example, my type rating is an Airbus 320 family of aircraft, I'm able to fly a 318, a 319, a 320, and a 321 on the same type rating. And most operators do, okay? On a cross-crew qualification then, all right, with the 4-day conversion, moving to a 330, I would hold a 330 type rating and a 350 type rating by only being type rated on a 330. So it's a common type rating. I would have to do differences training on a 350, of course, but I hold a common type rating between a 330 and a 350. So in an Airbus, I would hold a 320 type rating, which allows me to fly the smaller aircraft, or I'd hold a 350 or 330 type rating, which would allow me to fly then the longer range aircraft. Obviously, 340s are a separate type, and it would require a separate type rating. Boeing is slightly different in the sense that Boeing is moving towards cross-crew qualifications. At the moment, you'd have to hold a type rating for the various Boeing types that you'd operate, be it a classic Boeing 737, all right, obviously the new generation, Boeing 737 NG, the 600 to 900, or otherwise then a Dreamliner, the 787, okay? Or otherwise a 777 would be a slightly different kettle of fish as well.
Awesome. Well, Wayne, we've also got another question here. A few questions revolving around getting into the industry and flight instruction. Stefan and Ian and Zomo. Stefan says, good day, everyone. A question I get asked often as a fellow flight instructor is it worthwhile doing a flight instructor rating after completion of your CPL, and how will it benefit my future career in aviation? Additionally, Ian asked, what are the opportunities and pathways available with regards to forecast in the training department?
All right, let me answer that question from the airline perspective. All right, every airline around the world has a very structured and a large training department. All right, they do their own in-house training, be it proficiency training, recurrency training, or type conversion training. Airlines do that themselves. And what airlines are looking for are pilots with past or prior instructional experience to be absorbed into those training departments. So any instructional experience or expertise that you offer an operator would always be held in very high regard, because if you are the right type of person, you would be absorbed into that airline training department with time. Not initially, but with time. So it's a qualification that will certainly stand you in great stead down the line. Okay. But the next question everyone asks is, I'm going to use an instructor's rating to get the hours I require to get into an airline. Because an airline requires an ATPL, for example, and it needs 1,500 hours of flight time. I've only got a CPL, and I've got 200 hours of flight time. So yes, an instructional pathway directly after a CPL is a way to get the hours that you require and the higher license that you'd be required to have for employment in an airline type operation. But I might just add is that with the number of pilots, the shortfall of pilots that are going to be around in the next 5 to 6 years, okay, that requirement, that 1,500 hour requirement or that 500 hours on top requirement that presently exists before you're eligible for its selection is going to change. Airlines are going to have to look at suitably qualified type-rated pilots, albeit only with 250 or 300 hours total time, okay, for employment. That is the way the pathway is going to go. It's been happening in Europe for the last 10 years. All the cadet programs, I'll use a number, EasyJet, prior to 2019, was employing 350 200-hour cadets every year. EasyJet. 200-hour pilots coming through their cadet program, all right, were employed as direct first officers, 350 a year. So it's been proved already.
Wayne, Bradley Johnson and Yaj now also along a similar line in terms of experience requirements. Brad say, morning, is it healthy to be working to go straight into the airline industry after getting a fresh CPL, or is it better to get experience from parts of the industry such as charter, etc.?
All right, Brad, great question. The traditional pathway prior to 2019, the last 10, well, not even the last 10 years, let's say prior to 2015, the normal pathway, what is everyone else done is that I've got a CPL, I then got myself a King Air rating or a 1900 rating or a Let 410 rating, and I went and flew around charter operations for 2,000 hours or 3,000 hours, and then eventually I got myself a 320 or an Airbus, sorry, a Boeing type rating, and I made myself available and I was employed either on an Embraer or whatever I was employed on, right? That was the good old days. That's how we used to do it. It is not going to be the way moving forward, all right? It's the age-old story. If you're going to become an Airbus specialist, the sooner you specialize as an Airbus operator, the easier and better and more streamlined your pathway is going to be into Airbus operations, albeit Embraer operations, albeit Boeing operations. So the fact that I have 2,000 hours in the charter industry, yes, certainly experience that can never, ever be taken away from you, but is it going to be a prerequisite over the next 5 to 8 years? No. The airlines are going to be looking for correctly qualified, type-rated, suitable pilots. That's what they're going to be looking for, with the correct competencies to operate the aeroplanes that they're flying.
And Wayne, Yaj, just touching on something similar to Brad, but maybe with a slightly different approach. Hello, Captain Westoby. What type of experience do you think is valuable in terms of building flight experience for fresh commercial pilots? Does flying certain types of aircraft, such as a single-engine piston, jet, microlight, multi-engine piston, turboprop, really matter? Or does gaining overall flight experience, regardless of aircraft type, more attractive to an employer?
Oh yes, I mean, let me rather put the shoe on the other foot. If you were an airline employing pilots, if you were an airline looking to employ a pilot, who would you be looking for? What attributes, what experiences would you want that pilot to have? And remember, you're going to give that pilot your Airbus 320 or your Boeing 737 or your Embraer 145 to go and fly. So it comes back to, again, experience can never, ever be taken away from you. Be it microlight experience, be it turboprop piston experience, it can never be taken away from you. But whatever experience you put into your logbook must be building blocks. That experience whatever experience you expose yourself to, must be a building block towards the competencies and the requirements of operating the aircraft you eventually want to fly. And like I said, you're either going to become an Airbus specialist, an Embraer specialist, or a Boeing specialist. So I really would, I would encourage that the sooner you can start moving towards swept wing jet operations, right, high speed swept wing jet operations, the easier and smoother your pathway into aviation is going to be in the next 10 years.
Wayne, I think that addresses all the questions that we have from the viewers watching out there today. Thanks again for joining us. Your insights and inputs on the recently released CAE pilot forecast and the pathways forward as the industry starts to recover. It's greatly appreciated. Thank you, everyone. Have a fantastic week and keep safe. Until next time.